By 4 a.m., as America sat crushed under the weight of the Chinese and coalition juggernaut, as the gargantuan Chinese invasion forces, complemented by an additional large contingent of Russian forces numbering 2 million to the Chinese 10 million of their regular reserve and ready reserve military forces, as well as China's many paramilitary forces, which were all combat grade trained and armed with surplus equipment passed down from the regular PLA. These forces, along with the 2 million Russian military forces, both active and reserve units, as well as the proverbial icing on the cake being the additional 500,000 other foreign troops from various different nations involved in the coalition. These forces were running roughshod over the American defenses, which by this point in time were very few and far between, as America was not only slow to mobilize its very limited resources in the way of its armed forces, but also, even had they been able to, the crushing weight of the tandem anti-sat cyber strikes and local on-booting of various electronic warfare assets made ISR and communications all but impossible, except for at very close ranges, as the nation's cities and highway infrastructure, such as in this image, an armored battle had erupted in the east of Dallas, wherein Chinese Type 88C main battle tanks of one of the Ready Reserve 59th PLA Group Army subunits had engaged them, along with loitering munitions support from their CH-901A loitering munitions, which were produced in unquantifiable numbers, as also this grouping of Type 88Cs is seizing control of Interstate 35 West in Fort Worth, as also their mechanized infantry forces and other armored assets, including also Type 96Bs of an additional subunit, were, along with enormous artillery support, smashing their way through the cities, including in these example illustrations or animations of the combat unfolding in the DFW battle, including this Chinese Z-10 attack helo gunship, one of many that were attacking an American artillery battalion from the 56th Infantry Brigade combat team tasked with defending the international airport from what would become a combined armored and air assault attack, as the PLA 83rd Group Army of the regular active duty PLA forces had effectively deployed their air assault brigade to support the 59th PLA Group Army of the PLA's massive Ready Reserve forces in this battle. As it pertained to the combat unfolding in the San Antonio battle, the Russian forces had by now, with their very own powerful formations within the 2nd Combined Arms Army of Russia, completely overran the American installations located throughout the San Antonio area, as also they had cleared the flanks on numerous occasions, including wrapping up most recently combat in the Ingram Mall, where they had opted to surgically go into the mall in order to spare non-combatant refugee lives in a rare act of mercy, as their combat engineer forces, along with enormous air support from the PLAAF, rapidly overran the Randolph Air Force Base, along with also missile strikes from the PLA Strategic Missile Forces units sitting across the border in Mexico, as well as a Trojan Strategic Missile Forces Brigade, the 616th, sitting in eastern Texas as the 612th and 613th, which were reinforced brigades with called-up reserve battalions to fire either widely mass-produced systems, such as the DH-10A long-range subsonic cruise missiles, or older systems that were specifically earmarked for their use in terms of tactical ballistic missiles, as the Russians also utilized their special operations forces that were attached to the 2nd Combined Arms Army, such as the Spetsnaz Battalion, officially called the 70th Special Purposes Detachment. Some of their comprising companies, 3 apiece, participated in both the Lackland Air Force Base battle and also the battle that erupted in Camp Bullis, actually initiating the ground combat as they were shuttled into battle aboard the Russian VVS, or Air Force Mi-35M attack helo gunships, as there was a detachment of 32 of them earmarked specifically to the San Antonio battle. As they were divvied up 16 apiece, they were able to shuttle in a company at a time in very short, rapid order, as it did not take an immense amount of time to do this, as the CCP regime property upon which these Russian Spetsnaz forces were posted was within exceedingly short flight distance between the different battle spaces upon which these comprising companies of the 70th Special Purposes Detachment were assigned, and the CCP regime property upon which they were posted, as they, along with the Russian Armored Battalion, including its anti-tank company equipped with the state-of-the-art BMP-T Terminator anti-tank vehicles, which also could easily wipe out other types of targets, along with their tank companies, 4 of which were equipped with the T-72B3Ms, as their armored battalion within the 30th Motor Rifle Brigade had 4 tank companies of these main battle tanks, their anti-tank company with the BMP-T Terminators, and 2 companies of armored infantry troops equipped with their infantry fighting vehicles, which were the BMP-3s and their MTLB armor personnel carriers, as the mechanized infantry forces, which were effectively the same as the armored infantry, although the armored infantry were simply the mechanized infantry within an armored battalion. The mechanized infantry battalion, along with a battalion of combat engineers, as well as the armored battalion, had smashed their way into Camp Bullis from the south and also southwest, as the Spetsnaz forces were landed in the east and north of the installation, as their 3 companies simply captured the combat air landing strip, as that was of critical importance to the coalition forces in the area, as well as also ensuring that nobody would manage to escape the enormous artillery barrage that was taking place, that was executed predominantly by the 385th Guards Artillery Brigade, but also joined by the TOS 1A Battalion within the 2nd NBCR Protection Regiment, as the Russian NBCR troops were actually they who operated the Russian Army's thermobaric artillery, as mentioned previously, as well as also tactical ballistic missile strikes from the 950th Rocket Brigade, as well as Chinese missile strikes, again from across the border from cruise missiles, as well as also in the case of the Randolph Air Base battle, separate from the battle in Camp Bullis and Lackland, which also Lackland had suffered these strikes in addition to Randolph, were being hit by the 616th Strategic Missile Forces Brigade in addition to the 612th and 613th firing their long-range DH-10A cruise missiles, as the 616th had fired DF-15Cs, DF-11As, and in some cases DF-15Bs as well to strike these two installations. By now, as also massive flank clearance operations had been ongoing, as mentioned previously, which also included the combat that unfolded at the Ingram Mall, the other flank clearance operations occurring throughout pertain to the 30th Motor Rifle Brigade forces moving en route to their final objective at Camp Bullis, as well as also in the south, as the Venezuelan 13th Infantry Brigade had forces clearing the flanks, also acting as reinforcements to take off pressure from the 950th Rocket Brigade, while others cleared the south-central areas of the city, and the Volunteer Nicaraguan Combat Battalion, armed and equipped by both the Chinese and Russians, had cleared areas adjacent to the San Antonio River in a rather wealthy and upscale neighborhood in the area before moving deeper into the city to clear the flanks to support yet another operation, as the two Venezuelan mechanized infantry battalions that had cleared the flanks in the south-central portion of the city were now moving against the former Brooks Air Force Base, now called the Brooks City Base. While it was true that it was a mixed development area, it was also the home of a consortium of high technology companies, a defense contracting firm, a major one at that, known as KBR, and also an oil company, political offices for two key political figures, as well as more, as it also had a luxury hotel, hospital, and housing, and even smaller businesses such as restaurants and more, likely to conceal the fact that this mixed development area was utilized as a key site for companies, corporations, contractors that had ties to the DoD and DARPA, as well as also, again, two political offices of two key political figures were present as well. As the 3rd Battalion within the 13th Infantry Brigade had likewise cleared the flanks in the southwest of the city and was now moving through downtown en route to another flank clearance operation, they would also, like the Nicaraguans, be assisting in clearing the flanks for this operation, as these armed reactionary civilian elements had popped up on the ISR assets, on the proverbial and literal radar, if you will, as the ISR capabilities were exceedingly extensive and massive, as the Chinese and Russian near total surveillance grid could see widely throughout massive swathes of the nation as the combat was unfolding all throughout it, including within the South Central invasion sector. Although, again, as mentioned previously, like any system, there were always holes in the proverbial armor that could be exploited. And there would be a fair number of individuals who would exploit these gaps. But for the time being, the armed reactionary elements were easily brushed aside for the most part. Despite very small-scale successes, they could not withstand this gargantuan invasion, and most of the small-scale successes were against the Nicaraguan Combat Battalion, which was nowhere near as large or as heavily equipped as their Venezuelan counterparts, especially Serbian counterparts, and most of all, their Russian counterparts, which by far had the heaviest firepower of all the coalition forces in the San Antonio battle space. The Nicaraguans would suffer the highest casualty rate per capita, although they were only a square 1,000 strong battalion, as battalion sizes varied from country to country, but typically sat between 650 and 1,000, or sometimes more, sometimes less. And the Nicaraguans, with a square 1,000 troops, had already lost dozens of troops, both KIA and WIA, in their first flank clearance operation, although they did achieve their objective before moving on to other objectives in the east of the city. They again had suffered some casualties casualties and would suffer more in their newest operations, while they would receive some fire support from Venezuelan artillery and even a PLAAF missile strike fired by a JH-7 firing 2 KD-88 standoff air-to-ground cruise missiles with an over 100-mile range fired at much shorter distance. They would still take casualties as they had, again, pushed through an upscale neighborhood in earlier combat and by now had moved into the east of the city. They had corralled a grouping of about 300 armed reactionary American civilians after gradually fighting them and pushing them into an area, into a former closed-down factory complex within which they had tried to launch several small-scale assaults, which ultimately failed because although the Nicaraguans had heavier weapons and they had MRAPs with heavy crew-serve machine guns aboard, such as the Chinese W-85 heavy 12.7mm machine gun, or the Russian DSHK, which also was a 12.7mm heavy machine gun, and also their Russian and Chinese small arms that equip these forces, and light anti-armor capabilities, and even hand grenades, of course. They, despite having their refresher small unit tactical training, made small mistakes and would send in their forces piecemeal, which did not help their cause, nor were their forces, despite their refresher training, able to cope with some of the floor plans inside of this massive compound, as this was only a very tiny view of the overall size of the complex that this battalion was assaulting after having first pushed the Americans into this complex after fighting them through various neighborhoods in the east of the city. Now they would be receiving Venezuelan artillery and the Chinese air support from the 2 KD-88 air-to-ground standoff cruise missile strikes, which would assist them greatly in their final push to take this facility and eliminate the armed reactionary civilian threat after suffering several dozen more casualties in the process. As now, the fighting pertaining to the former Brooks Air Force Base, or again called the Brooks City Base, was unfolding as after all the flank clearance operations in the south and enormous artillery strikes that had been going on since the beginning of the battle from the Venezuelans' own artillery forces, having to divvy up their firing batteries that comprise this battalion between supporting the flank clearance operations and also shelling their major objective, which was the former Brooks Air Force Base, in preparation for their forces reaching it to overrun it. There were deployed on this installation 1,200 American paramilitary forces coming from America's largest alphabet paramilitary branch, known as the DHS, who had the most paramilitary forces out of all of America's paramilitary elements, as their element was over 200,000 strong, and even included the Coast Guard, which was a military branch but was paired with this paramilitary force. And they deployed 1,200 of their paramilitary elements to defend this site, as it was seen as a critical national security site, not just for the political reasons, but also for the military, scientific, industrial reasons, as there were biotech companies and other high technology companies. There was even an office of a major oil refining company, which was once known as Allegiance Refining and now renamed San Antonio Refinery. There was DPT Labs, and there were other companies as well. The Texas Senator's Office for District 19, House District 119, the other, and of course DPT Labs, Nisei America, DPT Labs being one of the bioscience companies, and there was Nisei America, Mission Solar, and other large companies. But one of the biggest defense contractors that had a presence on this site was KBR, which was widely known and had enormous defense contracts, which is why this area was dubbed as a Tier 2 priority area, as the Tier 1 priority targets, of course, were the installations such as the two air bases being Lackland and Randolph, as well as also the site of the current bivouacked unit of the 81st Stryker Brigade Combat Team, which was in fact Camp Bullis, and of course Fort Sam Houston, which was about to be seized by a Russian Combat Engineer Battalion, clearing the flanks before moving to take the installation, and would be joined by the Venezuelan Mechanized Infantry Battalion, the third of three, that would be moving in to support this action after clearing the flanks for the operation unfolding at the Brooks Air Force Base, while the Nicaraguans cleared the flanks slightly to the north and east. As now, the artillery fire was also joined by very powerful Russian artillery, as the Russian 2S-19 MSTA self-propelled 152mm howitzers joined in. The former two firing battalions of these howitzers, which had partaken in the enormous shelling of Lackland, had, since the end of this combat, diverted the rest of their attention to assisting the Venezuelan forces in the capture of Brooks, as even before Lackland ended, the Venezuelan artillery, again, having divvied up their firing batteries of their battalion to support their actions on the flanks, with also at the same time having 1 to 2 batteries shelling the site that they were to capture, their ultimate objective, the Brooks City Base, or former Air Force Base. The Russians had joined in, and which led to enormously more firepower being poured down on the site, leading to most of it being shelled to utter total complete ruination by the time Venezuelan forces crossed the San Antonio River and had arrived on site. The two battalions that had moved north and slightly east together had, upon crossing the river, had one battalion surround the interior to seize the site, while the other battalion faced outward with its comprising companies as they would guard the closer in flanks of this operation, just to ensure that no forces of any considerable size or type could somehow, some way interfere, which was highly unlikely, as the clusters of armed reactionary civilians that did appear, at least in the near distance, were already being engaged by Venezuelan mechanized infantry and the light infantry forces of the Nicaraguan Volunteer Combat Battalion. As the Venezuelans had arrived on scene, the Russian and Venezuelans' own artillery was continuing to fall on the Brooks Air Force Base, as the Venezuelans' Otto Molera 105mm howitzers, although small in artillery caliber terms, were still able to sustain relatively high rates of fire, and when concentrating all their fire, now that their entire battalion could focus in on this site, besides a battery out of their battalion that was supporting the Nicaraguan forces, they were able to pour down even more firepower onto this site by this point in time, as their mechanized infantry battalions, comprised of their 6 mechanized infantry companies apiece, equipped with their infantry fighting vehicle BTR-80As, which had the remote control 30mm autocannon turret, which was absolutely devastating, such as this building that took 30mm fire, blasting out the floor and ceiling and walls here. And also the APC version, which was the BTR-80S, with the extremely powerful 14.5mm heavy anti-materiel machine gun, which was also technically classified as an air defense weapon due to its power and range, as well as also a coax 7.62x54mm on the actual APC, the BTR-80S. The BTR-80A, with its remote-controlled 30mm autocannon, was indeed a devastating weapon of even more power than the 14.5, but the 14.5 was also a hellaciously devastating weapon in its own right. And as these vehicles carried their troops into battle, they also had a fire support company equipped with light tanks, the French-made, albeit archaic, but still effective, and especially when used as an assault gun, AMX 30 or 13 rather /90s, as the AMX 13 light tanks /90 meant that it was equipped with the upgunned 90mm main weapon. They had as a turret weapon a general purpose machine gun, the M60, and the same caliber as the M60, the 7.62 NATO, which was a 7.62 by 51mm round, equipped the coax machine gun that was aside the main weapon. As these mechanized infantry companies also had their headquarters and support company, which totaled 8 companies between the 6 mechanized infantry, 1 light tank, and their headquarters and support company, which was their command and logistical elements. These comprised the Venezuelan mechanized infantry battalions, as again, the battalions organized themselves, as we go to the map, with one battalion facing in towards the facility and the other facing outward with its comprising companies. As these different companies spaced their vehicles out and their platoons, they all had interlocking fields of fire where they could mutually support one another over moderate distances, as their weapons were all quite very high-powered, so to speak. As the artillery was coming in at the very opening of this map, and paramilitary forces were coming out of underground areas, as there were still areas of this site that had leftover remains from the previous airbase, such as former underground bunkers and spaces that were utilized as shelter from the previous artillery barrage that came in from the Venezuelans, as again they would concentrate their artillery and gradually move as their fire missions were prepared according to the pre-prepared strike packages that were created by the real-time AI battlefield data processing system. And since they did not have combat data links and thus were not grafted into the system, were sent the information via radio from the Special Liaison Russian troops of the HHB, or Headquarters of Headquarters Battalion, over the 91st Headquarters Brigade, over the entire 2nd Combined Arms Army. They would radio the information to the FDCs of the artillery forces, who would then pass it down to the gun lines, as the AI could translate over radio from Russian or Chinese to any other language, and thus could communicate seamlessly and rapidly and immediately with all the coalition partners. And thus, these forces were able to fire almost as fast as those that had direct access to the system, with the pre-prepared strike missions coming down, the pre-prepared fire missions, strike packages. Therefore, the artillery was well guided and gradually engulfed the entire site, leveling, razing to the ground many of its structures, and was then joined by Russian artillery, again, which was even more powerful, as the howitzer battalions, 2 of which from the 385th Guards Artillery Brigade that had been tasked with the Lackland battle, had now been able to reorient to support their Venezuelan allies, as the rest of the 385th Guards was on standby to support other operations if need be, as there were still yet 2 more howitzer battalions, also the 2 rocket battalions of BM-21 Grad systems, and of course the Tornado S battalion with its massive 300mm rocket artillery. As the site was being savagely shelled, as we go to this map, it was a 2-mile by 1.5-mile area in terms of total scale, as the paramilitary forces were equipped with their MRAPs, similar to how the Nicaraguans were equipped with basic VP3 MRAPs. The Americans had their own basic MRAP model that was quite popular, the Max Pro MRAPs. And as they tried to flee the site, the Venezuelan mechanized infantry forces, with their potent IFVs, with their 30mm autocannons, and even the 14.5, which was more powerful than the 12.7 or Russian and Chinese 50 cal equivalent, could shred through these MRAPs, and along with the 90mm light tank ammunition from the AMX 13 /90s, had torn through these MRAPs with ease, destroying them as they approached the perimeter of this site. As the city spanned all around the Brooks Air Force Base, the former airbase itself sat in an area surrounded by fields and some scattered wooded areas. There was a gas station along this route here, and there were roads that led out and away from the site and back into the dense urban terrain that spanned much of the San Antonio area. This was I-37, which ran relatively near the site, and as the map opens up, a JH-7 had fired its two KD-88 standoff air-to-ground cruise missiles, which, again, had a range of well over 100 miles. As they had their over 100-mile range, they were fired far short of that, and were fired in support of the Nicaraguans who were fighting at the abandoned industrial site in the east of the city to support their attack on the facility, as well as also being joined again by Venezuelan artillery from one battery of their Otomalera towed howitzers, which were 105 millimeter and were very easy to set up, highly portable, and had a very high sustained rate of fire, although this wouldn't be abused, of course, as the Venezuelan artillerymen knew when to let their tubes cool down and when to do maintenance on these howitzers, as to abuse this feature would end up warping the barrel and causing deadly accidents, and a good gun crew knew when they could utilize this capability and when they needed to give it a rest, as the saying went, and they, along with the missile strikes, enabled the Nicaraguans to move in and finish off their opposition within this large factory complex. Again, this was only a very small part of it, and there was fighting going on all around the grounds, as it was completely and totally surrounded by this full battalion, all its comprising companies, as they pushed their way in and towards the facility on all sides. And while this JH-7 was in the area, not only did it fire its KD-88s in support of the Nicaraguan forces that were literally just to the north and slightly east of the site, they also conducted an airstrike that was already predetermined by the real-time AI battlefield data processing system and called in without even the Venezuelans finding out until the last second by radio, as the system itself had sent the information to the Chinese combat data links, which in turn caused the strike to come in support of their allies as they dropped 4 1,000-pounders on this cluster of paramilitary forces and their 4 Max Pro MRAPs, which also destroyed this building completely and horribly gutted this one on this end, as DH-10A cruise missiles were also entering the area at the opening of this map. This battle on this map is actually beginning minutes into the actual battle itself, which would last a total of 45 minutes. As the battle was very straightforward, it was not a very complex operation. It was simply a cordon and sweep operation for the most part. They had cordoned the inner perimeter and an outer perimeter to prevent anybody from coming against these forces, as the headquarters and support company of this battalion of its comprising companies is off the map and away from the combat itself. Most of the headquarters platoons are off map as well and away from the fighting. The headquarters platoons of these combat companies, as these were the combat elements, the 3 combat platoons with their headquarters and support platoon, or headquarters platoon, which was the command and logistical elements, just off the map. Although this one is seen because this one belongs to the light tank company, and this mechanized infantry company is moving further around and to the east to bolster the numbers on this side of the installation, although these forces effectively had their fields of fire to where nobody could escape without being seen, and the ISR capabilities of the Russians and Chinese from the Chinese armed high-altitude CH-4A recon drones, as well as the Russian forepost drones, were sending all the relevant information, of course, to the Russian combat data links through the real-time AI battlefield data processing system, which in turn the Russian special troops radioed immediately to their Venezuelan allies about where enemies were and where and how to move. Their entire movements were coordinated through this system over the radio, as the Russian liaison troops informed them where to go, what to do, what weapons were safe, angle and traverse, and all of the relevant information needed to achieve their desired outcome, to achieve their objectives in this battle. As at the opening of the map, this entire block has been completely shelled into total ruination by Venezuelan artillery. Russian artillery is impacting here, destroying these paramilitary forces. Early on, these forces tried to fight this platoon, which is just off map, which belongs to this company. There's a platoon here, one here. As they came up onto the site, they had destroyed with their 30mm autocannons and 14.5mm machine guns from both their BTR-80A, IFVs, and BTR-80S, APCs, these vehicles here, as they also destroyed this one. The platoon here, there's green shown because they were right off the map before this map opened, before they arrived in the opening. They had briefly exchanged fire with these forces before they ran into the direct fire path of these vehicles here, into their field of fire, where they cut them down, although they briefly tried to fire at these vehicles. As the green indicates, they were taking fire. They had returned fire and decimated this group, while this group was destroyed by ISR-guided artillery, and all the ISR-guided artillery had flattened this block and anybody that was in it. These forces were hit by Russian artillery, as indicated by the light blue imminent strike markers. These paramilitary forces had just gotten out of this area at the opening where these shells impact. These forces were KIAs, while this group just got out of that area that was being hit when more artillery strikes came in and got them, which was also ISR directed but liaison through the Russian forces back to their Venezuelan allies, to their FDC, as the pre-prepared strike packages were passed down to the gun line and fired in response and destroying these forces. They also would hit these buildings with enormous volumes of fire. As the howitzers trained on this site, they would fire 8 shells apiece on these buildings and this area right behind this one here. While these forces ran out, they would be hit by other howitzers firing shells into this area, as well as the ground-based fire, as they would briefly exchange fire with these vehicles as they tried to flee these light tanks. But these light tanks would fire 90mm shells, whether HE, whether fragmentation, or whether heat shells, which they fired heat shells and destroyed this column of Max Pro MRAPs trying to flee the facility, and they fired fragmentation shells and destroyed this group, fired a heat shell and destroyed this vehicle between these two wooded areas here. And these vehicles briefly exchanged fire with these forces coming out of this building and these forces here, just as these light tanks were at the same time. Again, there's a lot of activity going on these maps. It's very difficult to show all of it in a coherent order, but as always, it's being attempted. As these forces of this platoon destroyed this vehicle and this vehicle before this company would go down this road and then swing around to this side of the post, the fields of fire between these vehicles and these vehicles covered this entire area, as mentioned earlier, and they were able, in a very brief series of engagements, to completely annihilate these paramilitary forces. Again, as it was anticipated by the Americans that before the invasion, as they had no idea that a full-scale invasion was even coming, that they would be able to give orders to these forces deployed to this area, the 81st Stryker Brigade Combat Team, to augment and boost the security of the local installations, whether the air bases, the Army installation at Fort Sam Houston, or Randolph Air Base, as well as also even bolster security at Brooks. And thus, besides the paramilitary forces that got sent here first, who were setting up their campsite in this area, as the old series of runways, although dismantled, had been either turned into roads or pathways. If one were to look at a photograph of the area, they would see this. These tents had been basically constructed in this area, while there were the commercial buildings. There was even a luxury hotel and also restaurants and also even a hospital that were built in this area on this site, all of which, though, had been horribly shelled. Although the hospital wasn't intentionally targeted, it was effectively razed to the ground as the intensity of the fire was simply too much, and the areas that were being shelled very near it basically caught it in the crossfire as well, and effectively caused it to collapse as the shelling was far too intense between all of the shell fire coming in from both the Venezuelans and Russians. The entire area had simply been gutted and turned into pulverized rubble. And that went for all the buildings surrounding the hospital and the hospital itself, unfortunately. And many people perished in that particular artillery barrage. As unfortunate as it was, these things happened in war. Warfare was exceedingly ugly and resulted in these types of heinous results. As that had occurred, these forces trying to hold the perimeter of paramilitary elements were getting return fire from very powerful vehicle-based fire and Venezuelan artillery strikes as the BTR-80As and S's, the IFVs being the A's and the S's being the APCs, levied heavy 30 millimeter fire, also 14.5 millimeter fire, and 7.62 by 54 millimeter fire from also the S with the 14.5 at these forces as the 105 millimeter strikes came in and decimated them as they were alongside of this road that effectively went around the perimeter of the facility and destroyed these paramilitary forces as they had achieved this objective and also destroyed this MRAP that was effectively guarding one of the entryways in. The platoons from two different companies, from this company and this company in the south, had this platoon and this platoon were part of this company. This was the light tank company that sat outside. They would not be sending in their vehicles. They sent in 2 platoons each to seize control of the facility as one platoon entered in the north, coming in from the west. This platoon right here that had briefly exchanged fire with these forces. After first moving in and pausing temporarily, they continued their movement to this area before holding their position as these forces have been cut down. This platoon would move in from the southwest and hold their position here. They had fields of fire that would watch towards the east through the facility. Although there were buildings blocking and obscuring their view in some areas, this would matter little, as this platoon would go straight up through this area, and as these forces were running down the road, they briefly took fire from around the corner from this single vehicle, this BTR-80S, firing at 7.62 coax and also 14.5 fire, cutting a few of these personnel down while the others went around, only to run into these vehicles of this platoon that had moved in. After pausing temporarily, after moving in early on, they continued on, and by the time they reached this point, as they rapidly moved through the site, they briefly exchanged fire. The lead vehicle, which was the IFV, the BTR-80A, fired its 30 millimeter autocannon and cut these remaining forces down, who tried to return fire with their small arms, but they were ineffective and were simply annihilated. It has to be remembered that these paramilitary American forces were not equipped with any type of anti-armor or anti-tank capabilities. The most potent weapon they had were crew-serve weapons. They were permitted to operate on top of their MRAPs, which were the M250 cals, and besides that, that was effectively the most powerful weapon they had access to, which the 50 cal was a powerful weapon indeed, as so was the Chinese and Russian 12.7 millimeter. But the vehicles that came up against them outranged them and had more powerful weapons like a 30 millimeter autocannon and the 14.5 on the APCs, the 14.5 being even more powerful than the 50 cal or the 12.7 millimeter, and thus they outranged these weapons and had more power than the weapons that were mounted on these MRAPs, Max Pro MRAPs, and thus were able to destroy these vehicles with ease, along with the enormity of the firepower coming from their light tanks, which were like assault guns again, and also from the artillery forces of both the Venezuelan artillery from their 105 millimeter Otto Malera M56 howitzers, as well as also the Russian, even heavier, even far more powerful 152 millimeter MSTA 2S19 MSTA self-propelled howitzers, combining that also with a localized airstrike in this area as a close air support strike, as well as also offering close air support further away before conducting this strike, firing their 2 KD-88 air-to-ground standoff cruise missiles before rapidly reaching and dropping their air-to-ground munitions in this area, before also cruise missiles came in, 2 DH-10As hitting the same site, destroying this remains of this building and leaving a massive crater in this area. As these forces ran out, they were wiped out by the air-to-ground munitions as well as also ground-based fires, and as a result, there was very little that these paramilitary forces could do in the face of such a very powerful ground assault, as well as the very potent assortment of artillery being utilized against them, both 105 and 152 millimeter, and of course, the air power and even missile strikes. As all of this was simply far too much, as again, this is a very straightforward battle, not overly complicated. These forces would dismount and watch different sectors of fire to give mutual dismounted infantry support to their vehicles that shuttled them into battle, and they would hold the area before the other platoons that had sent in their vehicle-based forces would dismount their troops, as this platoon would also, after eliminating these forces, after dispatching them with also receiving fire support from these forces, as they also cut these down. This is all ISR directed, it has to be remembered. The Russian liaison troops were continuing a steady stream of communications between all of these forces, telling them where to go, where to fire, where the enemy was, including some that ran out. There were 20 that ran out of this building, and they were cut down by the platoons here and here before this one started moving in. And also there were the light tanks continuing to fire into the site anywhere targets presented themselves. Russian artillery strikes, ISR-directed Venezuelan strikes. All of it was devastating, destroying the campsite that was being set up, again, not just for the paramilitary forces of the Americans, but also for the anticipated arrival of at least some of the 81st Stryker Brigade combat team, whether it was companies or even a whole battalion that would have been sent to bolster security in this sector. It was unable to be achieved, and these forces faced a devastating defeat in this very rapid and, again, straightforward battle. This was very short and to the point. As they came in and watched their sectors of fire, when the ISR assets confirmed that there were no more sightings of any paramilitary forces or any armed resistance, that was when, after this platoon smashed their way in and came around to this area, they would all send their dismounted forces out and to begin scouring for survivors. And they would find them. They would find them hiding in the underground areas that remained within this former air base, some of which beneath the buildings themselves, beneath what was now rubble. And they would pull out approximately, in total, 380 paramilitary survivors who had become enemy prisoners of war, or POWs, simply prisoners of war, and they would be taken to the POW collection points that were established by the headquarters forces, not just at the company level, but also at the battalion level of the attacking battalion of the 13th Infantry Brigade that was actually assaulting the site. As there again, the 2nd Battalion of the two was guarding the outside approaches, while the battalion facing the former installation went in and assaulted it. As a result of this battle, not only was a key political and defense industrial in terms of the defense contractors and also the scientific industrial base, not only was a key component of it completely leveled and razed to the ground, but also the prisoners netted was of use for intelligence gathering purposes, and the Venezuelans had achieved one of the set out objectives of the overall San Antonio operation, which brought under control a portion of the local transportation network, which was a large segment of I-37. Although I-37 was not the main critical piece of highway needing to be controlled, as the Russians controlled the southern portions of it by now after the flank clearance operations earlier, including the destruction of these elements before taking control of the CPS power station, which was another important objective as it was along the Victor Browning Lake here. They now controlled a major portion of I-37, which was at least a key logistical route for the local forces, and also, I-35 was ever more under the coalition's control through this vital node. As the Venezuelans moved through the downtown area, this grouping of armed reactionary civilians had not appeared as of yet, but they would in this area as they would cluster together from surrounding areas, and as the Russians would move in to seize the critical highway junction that was the downtown area, they would engage these forces, including these forces that would join them, making a total of just over 400 armed reactionary civilians in this particular pocket that needed to be engaged. As this Venezuelan battalion had cleared the flanks before moving through this area, and now were clearing this area along with the Nicaraguans that had been mentioned clearing this area, with some Venezuelan artillery support from one firing battery. That same battery would now shift their support to assisting this battalion that was already there and fighting, but they needed to do this first because this was seen as more of an emergency, as well as so was the fighting for the Brooks Air Force Base, as this was their major objective of the whole brigade. They now, after achieving this objective here, would be able to support the Russian capture of the Fort Sam Houston, which would occur in very short order after this flank had been cleared, and now their logistical operations upon clearing these flanks had been concluded. They would effectively walk in and take Fort Sam Houston without a fight, which was a massive objective that needed to be fulfilled, as this was perhaps one of the most important installations in the country, as it was a headquarters of U.S. Army North and South, and also the headquarters of MedCom, Medical Command. As this had been taken, now the Venezuelans could leave a battalion in this area, and they could divert resources and attention to other areas, as in within this particular sector, to ensure that no further resistance elements popped up within the general southeast of the map. And as the Russians were completing, by the time this area fell, the clearance of the north center of the city, they were now conducting a logistical resupply before preparing to push into the downtown area to seize this critical area of the city. And also, at around the same time, as the Mi-35s had concluded their logistical operations and refueling and maintenance activities, they were to shuttle the last two remaining companies from their CCP regime property into nearby Government Canyon and support them as they conducted their long-range reconnaissance and patrol activities. which would be a very important operation to flush out early resistors against the occupation, as San Antonio was nearly concluded in terms of an overall battle. There were still further actions that had to occur. Even the Serbian forces, which had played a massive role in the northeast of the battle space, would play an even further role by pushing along I-35 and into New Braunfels, which would lead to clearing the area between San Antonio and Austin of any and all armed civilian resistance, making it even easier to control another critical part of the route of Group Armies 7 through 13, which was of the PLA's external invasion prong that was pushing up I-35 upon concluding their operations along the border in Laredo, as that battle would wrap up formally by 7 a.m. As the battle in San Antonio still had some more combat actions left remaining. There will be more covered in the following installations of this hypothetical documentary series highlighting fourth-generation warfare doctrines within the scope of this Sino-Russian coalition invasion of America. More to come.